Welcome to the channel. This channel is dedicated to history and politics. Not just what happened, but how events were presented, shaped, and remembered. Today, we are examining one of the most powerful myths of the 20th century. The claim that the Cuban Missile Crisis was the moment the world came closest to nuclear annihilation. The claim that humanity stood 1 minute to midnight. And the claim that President John F. Kennedy saved the world. This narrative has been repeated for decades. It has been reinforced through education, media, and popular culture. It has become accepted as fact. But when we examine the declassified evidence, the internal discussions, and the strategic reality of 1962, the story begins to unravel. What emerges is not a world on the brink of immediate destruction. What emerges is a situation that was understood, managed, and ultimately exploited. By October 1962, the United States possessed overwhelming nuclear superiority over the Soviet Union, essai stratégique. Command data shows that the United States had thousands of nuclear warheads ready for delivery. The Soviet Union, by contrast, had a far smaller number of deployable long-range systems. The imbalance was not marginal. It was decisive. This is not interpretation. This is documented in declassified military assessments from the period. The United States also had nuclear missiles stationed in Europe. Jupiter missiles in Turkey and Italy were fully operational. These missiles had a range capable of striking deep into Soviet territory. They were positioned within minutes of major Soviet cities. They were armed with nuclear warheads, and they were ready to be used. Declassified National Security Council documents confirm that these deployments were active and known to Soviet leadership. From the Soviet perspective, this was not a stable balance. It was a direct and immediate threat. Khrushchev himself later stated that the presence of U.S. missiles in Turkey was a primary motivation for placing missiles in Cuba. This is supported by Soviet archival material released after the Cold War. The Cuban deployment was not an isolated act of aggression. It was a strategic response. When U-2 reconnaissance flights photographed missile installations in Cuba, the Kennedy administration was immediately aware of their existence. But the crucial issue was not presence, it was readiness. Declassified CIA reports from October 1960 to show that many of the missile sites were still under construction. Launch pads were incomplete. Support infrastructure was unfinished. Operational integration had not yet been achieved. These assessments were presented to senior officials. They were discussed within ExComm. They were understood. At no point in these internal discussions was there certainty that the missiles were ready for immediate launch. Instead, the intelligence picture was evolving, uncertain, conditional, time-dependent. And yet, none of this uncertainty was conveyed to the public. The question of nuclear warheads is even more revealing. At the time of the crisis, U.S. intelligence did not have definitive confirmation that nuclear warheads were fully deployed. This is reflected in declassified intelligence estimates. The administration was working with assumptions, not confirmed facts. There was concern, there was suspicion, but there was no absolute certainty. Despite this, the public message was clear and absolute. Nuclear missiles were in Cuba. They were dangerous. They could strike at any moment. The United States was under immediate threat. This was not a reflection of the internal intelligence picture. It was a simplification. ExComm transcripts, declassified in later decades, show that Kennedy and his advisors were aware that time existed. They debated options over several days. They considered air strikes. They considered invasion. They considered blockade. They considered negotiation. This was not a situation spiraling out of control. Kennedy himself acknowledged in private discussions that a diplomatic resolution was possible. He understood that Khrushchev was not seeking immediate war. He understood that the Soviet deployment had strategic motivations. And he understood that escalation could be controlled. Yet, the message presented to the American public was entirely different. The crisis was framed as urgent, immediate, existential. The famous televised address on October 22nd was delivered in a tone of grave warning. Kennedy spoke of a clear and present danger. He announced a naval quarantine. He framed the situation as one of unavoidable confrontation. This was not simply communication. It was political theater. Television amplified this message. For the first time, a global crisis was experienced in real time by millions of viewers. The visuals mattered. The tone mattered. The repetition mattered. News broadcasts reinforced the administration's framing. Public perception was shaped not by raw intelligence, but by curated narrative. The administration also controlled what was not said. The presence of U.S. missiles in Turkey was not disclosed. The possibility of a negotiated exchange was not discussed publicly. The incomplete status of Soviet missile sites was not explained. This selective presentation of information was not accidental, it was deliberate. The outcome of the crisis confirms this. The Soviet Union agreed to remove its missiles from Cuba. The United States agreed, privately, to remove its missiles from Turkey. This agreement was documented in declassified diplomatic communications. It was known to both sides. It was understood as the basis of resolution, and yet it was hidden from the public. Instead, the narrative presented was one of unilateral Soviet retreat. Kennedy was portrayed as having forced Khrushchev to back down. The United States was portrayed as having made no concessions. This was not accurate. Kennedy's claim that the United States faced the greatest peril in history must be examined in this context, because it does not align with historical reality. Entire civilizations have faced annihilation. Carthage was destroyed completely. Its population was killed or enslaved. Its culture erased. The Black Death eliminated vast portions of Europe's population. Cities were emptied. Societies collapsed. World War II saw destruction on an unprecedented scale. Millions died in industrialized warfare. Entire cities were leveled. Andin Japan appelliti, te were uzed, Hiroshima no inteor. To claim that October 1962 represented a greater danger than these events requires redefining danger itself. It requires elevating potential over actual destruction. The Cuban Missile Crisis was not 1 minute to midnight. It was a moment in which fear was amplified. It was a moment in which information was controlled. It was a moment in which political leadership benefited from the perception of crisis. And if anyone was truly under immediate nuclear threat, it was not the American population. It was the Soviet people. They lived under the shadow of operational American nuclear weapons stationed on their borders. They faced a strategic imbalance that placed them at constant risk. This is the reality that is rarely acknowledged. The myth of the Cuban Missile Crisis did not emerge naturally. It was constructed, it was reinforced, and it has endured, even in the face of declassified evidence that tells a far more complex story. Thanks for watching. The public version of the Cuban Missile Crisis was built on urgency. It was built on fear. It was built on the idea that nuclear war could begin at any moment. But inside the Kennedy administration, the conversation was very different. The declassified transcripts of the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, known as ExComm, reveal a far more controlled and calculated situation. These were not men reacting blindly to imminent destruction. These were policymakers weighing options, assessing intelligence, and managing escalation. From the very beginning, the issue of time was central. Declassified CIA briefings presented to ExComm made clear that the missile sites were not operational. They required further construction. They required additional equipment. They required time to become functional. This was understood at the highest levels of government. In an ExComm meeting on October 16th, the first day the crisis was formally discussed, officials immediately began debating responses. Airstrikes were considered. Invasion was considered. A blockade was considered. Diplomatic solutions were considered. This range of options only exists when time exists. If nuclear war had been truly imminent, there would have been no space for extended deliberation. There would have been no multi-day debate. Instead, the administration chose a measured response. They chose a naval quarantine. They chose to signal strength without immediate escalation. This decision reflects an understanding that the situation was not yet beyond control. The threat, while real, was not immediate as presented publicly. Declassified estimates show the United States did not have confirmed direct evidence of operational nuclear warheads ready for launch in Cuba at the time. There were assumptions, projections, but no definitive proof. This uncertainty was discussed internally, yet none of it reached the public. Kennedy, in private, acknowledged the strategic context. He understood the Soviet Union was responding to American missile deployments in Turkey. In one critical exchange, Kennedy noted that U.S. missiles in Turkey were just as threatening as Soviet missiles in Cuba were to the United States. This is a direct acknowledgement of equivalence. It undermines the public narrative of unilateral Soviet aggression. It reveals the crisis was reciprocal. The American people were not told that their government had already placed nuclear weapons on the Soviet Union's doorstep. The administration maintained strict control over information flow press briefings were tightly managed. Journalists were given limited access to raw intelligence. Photographs of missile sites were presented as definitive proof. They were annotated, but these images did not show readiness. They showed construction. Construction was presented as capability. The public was not reacting to raw evidence. They were reacting to interpretation shaped by the administration. The naval quarantine itself was also carefully framed. It was not called a blockade because a blockade is an act of war under international law. The use of quarantine softened the perception of aggression. It positioned the United States as defensive, even as it used military force. Behind the scenes, diplomatic channels remained active. Back-channel negotiations took place. Letters were exchanged between Kennedy and Khrushchev. The turning point came from agreement. Khrushchev proposed removing missiles from Cuba in return for a non-invasion guarantee and the removal of U.S. missiles from Turkey. Kennedy agreed to these terms. Publicly, he accepted the non-invasion pledge. Privately, he agreed to remove the Turkish missiles. Declassified documents confirm this exchange. The removal of Jupiter missiles from Turkey was not coincidental. It was the price of de-escalation, and yet this was not revealed to the American public. The resolution was presented as a clear victory. The Soviet Union backed down. Kennedy prevailed. This was not a complete account. It was a curated narrative that omitted key facts and reinforced a specific political outcome. The political benefits were immediate. Kennedy's approval ratings increased significantly. He was portrayed as calm under pressure, a global leader. The administration itself did not behave as if destruction was imminent. It behaved as if time existed. It behaved as if negotiation was possible. This is the central contradiction. The internal reality was measured. The public narrative was extreme. The Cuban Missile Crisis was not a spontaneous moment of global panic. It was a managed event, a controlled escalation, a carefully communicated story. The Cuban Missile Crisis was not only a political and military event, it was a media event. It was one of the first global crises to unfold in the age of television, and that changed everything. By 1962, television had become the dominant medium of communication. Millions received information from anchors, images, and presentation tone. The Kennedy administration understood that controlling the message meant influencing the public, transforming complex situations into simple narratives. Kennedy's address on October 22nd was carefully constructed. Every word was deliberate. Every pause was intentional. The tone was calm but grave. The message was clear. The United States was under threat. The Soviet Union had acted aggressively. Action was necessary. This was strategic communication. It framed the crisis to maximize urgency, minimize complexity, and position the president as the figure of control. Television amplified this framing. News networks repeated the message. There was little deviation, skepticism, or challenge. The imagery played a critical role. Reconnaissance photographs of Cuban missile sites were shown repeatedly, annotated with lines and labels. These images did not show warheads or launch capability. They showed construction, which was interpreted as immediacy. The public was not given the full context. They were not told intelligence was uncertain. They were shown images and given conclusions. Fear filled the gap. When information is simplified and urgency is emphasized, fear becomes the dominant response. Television created a sense of immediacy that did not match reality. Viewers experienced the crisis as a countdown toward catastrophe, but the actual process was slower. This gap between perception and reality is critical, shaping how the crisis was remembered. The administration needed public support and legitimacy. Fear provided all three, reducing opposition and encouraging trust in leadership. The Cuban Missile Crisis became a defining media event because it demonstrated the power of established narratives in public consciousness. Kennedy declared that no nation had ever faced a greater danger. But history is filled with moments of real, catastrophic destruction. Consider Carthage. The city was besieged, the population killed or enslaved, and its civilization erased. This was total annihilation. Consider the Black Death. It killed tens of millions. Entire towns were abandoned. This was a prolonged reality of death. In 1945, nuclear weapons were used. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were destroyed. The devastation was real, immediate, and irreversible. These events represent actual catastrophe destruction that occurred, not just the theoretical danger presented in the media of 1962. By contrast, the Cuban Missile Crisis was a moment of tension, a moment of fear, a moment of uncertainty. But it was not a moment of realized destruction. No cities were destroyed. No populations were annihilated. No nuclear weapons were used. To claim that October 1962 represented a greater danger than these events requires redefining the concept of danger itself. It requires elevating potential above reality. It requires treating fear as equivalent to experience. This is not a historical argument. It is a rhetorical one. It is designed to emphasize urgency, to elevate significance, to frame the moment as uniquely important. Kennedy's statement must be understood in this context. It was not an objective assessment. It was political language. It was designed to communicate seriousness, to unify the public, to justify action. Butovetim is a fact. It became embedded in the narrative of the crisis. It became part of how the event was remembered. The problem is not that the crisis was described as dangerous. The problem is that it was described as uniquely dangerous, as unparalleled, as the greatest threat in history. This claim distorts perspective. It shifts attention away from real historical catastrophes. It elevates a moment of managed tension above moments of actual destruction. It also reinforces the broader myth of the crisis. Because if the danger was the greatest in history, then the resolution must also be extraordinary. And if the resolution was extraordinary, then the leader responsible must be exceptional. This is how narrative works. Each element supports the others. The danger justifies the response. The response elevates the leader. The leader becomes central to the story. But when the initial claim is exaggerated, everything that follows is affected. The perception of risk becomes inflated. The evaluation of leadership becomes distorted. The memory of the event becomes mythologized. The Cuban Missile Crisis was serious. It involved nuclear weapons. It involved two superpowers. It involved real tension. But seriousness is not the same as singularity, and tension is not the same as catastrophe. When we compare October 1960 to two other moments in history, the difference becomes clear. Other societies faced annihilation not as a possibility, but as a reality. They experienced destruction directly. They endured consequences that were immediate and irreversible. The United States in 1960 did not experience this. It experienced fear. It experienced uncertainty. But it did not experience destruction. This distinction matters, because it challenges the central claim of the crisis narrative. It forces a reassessment of what actually occurred, and it highlights the gap between perception and reality. If the Cuban Missile Crisis was not the greatest peril in history, then what was it? It was a moment of heightened tension within a broader Cold War context. It was a strategic confrontation shaped by existing imbalances. It was a political event influenced by communication and perception. And it was a moment in which rhetoric played a central role. Rhetoric that elevated the sense of danger. Rhetoric that framed the event in dramatic terms. Rhetoric that has endured long after the details have been reassessed. The persistence of this claim reveals something important. It shows how easily perception can become reality in historical memory. It shows how repetition can transform rhetoric into accepted truth. And it shows how difficult it is to challenge narratives once they are established. But history is not fixed. It can be revisited, re-examined, reinterpreted. And when we do that with the Cuban Missile Crisis, the conclusion becomes unavoidable. It was not 1 minute to midnight. It was a moment that has been remembered as more dangerous than it actually was. By the end of October 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis was over. The missiles in Cuba were to be removed. The missiles in Turkey were to be removed. A quiet agreement had been reached. The immediate tension had passed. But something else had begun, a transformation of political image, a consolidation of power, and the construction of a narrative that would last for decades. Before the crisis, John F. Kennedy's presidency was uncertain. The Bay of Pigs invasion had been a failure. It had exposed weaknesses in planning and execution. It had damaged credibility. It had raised serious questions about leadership. His meeting with Khrushchev in Vienna had not improved matters. It had been seen as difficult. At times, it had been interpreted as a sign of inexperience. The Soviet leadership did not view him as dominant. And within the United States, doubts persisted. The Cuban Missile Crisis changed all of this. It provided an opportunity to reshape perception, an opportunity to redefine leadership. The narrative that emerged was simple. Kennedy had faced down the Soviet Union. He had refused to compromise. He had forced Khrushchev to retreat. He had saved the world. This narrative was not an inevitable conclusion. It was a constructed one. It depended on selective presentation. It depended on omission. The removal of U.S. missiles from Turkey was hidden. The negotiated nature of the settlement was downplayed. The strategic context was simplified. What remained was a story of strength, a story of victory, a story of leadership under pressure. The political benefits were immediate. Kennedy's approval ratings rose significantly after the crisis. Public confidence increased. Media coverage became overwhelmingly positive. Criticism diminished. This was not coincidental. It was the result of alignment between political messaging and media amplification. The administration presented a narrative. The media reinforced it. The public accepted it. Fear played a central role in this process. The public had been told that nuclear war was imminent, that destruction could occur at any moment, that the situation was unprecedented in danger. When that feared outcome did not occur, relief followed. And relief created gratitude. Gratitude toward leadership. Gratitude toward the figure who appeared to have prevented catastrophe. This is a powerful dynamic. Fear creates vulnerability, relief creates loyalty, and together they reinforce authority. The administration understood this. It understood the emotional impact of the crisis. It understood how perception could be shaped, and it benefited from that perception. This does not require assuming intent in the most extreme sense, but it does require recognizing advantage, recognizing that the framing of the crisis enhanced political standing, recognizing that the narrative served a purpose. Over time, this narrative became embedded. It entered education, it entered popular culture, it became the standard interpretation. The baby boomer generation, who experienced the crisis as children or young adults, internalized this narrative deeply. They remember the fear, they remember the broadcasts. They remember the sense that the world could end. These memories are real. The fear was real. The experience was real. But the interpretation of that fear is another matter. Because fear does not always reflect reality. It reflects perception, and perception can be shaped. For many, the Cuban Missile Crisis became a defining moment. A moment that gave their generation a sense of having faced unique danger. A moment that distinguished their experience from those who came before and after. This is how generational identity forms. It forms around shared experience, around shared memory, around shared narrative. The idea that they had lived through the most dangerous moment in human history became part of that identity. It reinforced a sense of significance. It gave weight to memory. It validated fear. Even as declassified documents began to emerge, this narrative remained intact. Evidence of negotiation, evidence of missile trade-offs, evidence of incomplete Soviet deployment. All became available over time. But the core belief did not change, because belief is not easily altered by information. especially when it is tied to identity, especially when it has been reinforced for decades. The portrayal of the Soviet Union also remained fixed. It was seen as aggressive, dangerous, unpredictable. This perception was shaped during the crisis. It was reinforced by media coverage. It was embedded in Cold War ideology. But when we examine the strategic reality, the situation appears differently. The Soviet Union was responding to American missile deployments. It was attempting to create balance. It was negotiating for the removal of weapons near its borders. If anyone was living under immediate nuclear threat, it was the Soviet population. American missiles in Turkey were operational. They were positioned close to major Soviet cities. They were ready. The Cuban deployment was an attempt to mirror that threat, to create equivalence, to force negotiation. And it succeeded. The missiles in Turkey were removed. The strategic imbalance was reduced. But this outcome was not presented in those terms. It was reframed as a victory for the United States, a defeat for the Soviet Union. This reframing shaped long-term perception. It reinforced existing biases. It simplified a complex interaction into a moral narrative. Kennedy was cast as a hero. Khrushchev was cast as the adversary who failed. The United States was cast as the defender, the Soviet Union as the aggressor. This structure has endured. It continues to influence how the crisis is understood. It continues to shape how it is taught. But when we return to the evidence, the conclusion becomes clearer. The crisis was not a moment of uncontrollable danger. It was a managed confrontation. It was resolved through negotiation. It involved mutual concessions. The narrative that followed was not an inevitable reflection of these facts. It was a constructed interpretation, one that served political purposes, one that reinforced leadership, one that elevated a moment of tension into a defining myth. The Cuban Missile Crisis was not simply remembered, it was framed. And the effects of that framing continue in how the Cold War is understood, in how nuclear danger is perceived, in how leadership is evaluated. The belief that October 1962 was 1 minute to midnight remains powerful. But when examined against evidence, it becomes difficult to sustain. By the end of this story, the Cuban Missile Crisis looks very different. Not as a moment of uncontrollable panic, not as the closest humanity has ever come to destruction, and not as a simple story of one man saving the world. It appears instead as a managed confrontation, a strategic contest shaped by existing nuclear imbalance, a political moment defined as much by messaging as by reality. The United States entered the crisis with overwhelming nuclear superiority. This is not disputed. It is confirmed in declassified military records. It had operational missiles in Europe. It had long-range bombers. The Soviet Union responded by placing missiles in Cuba, not from a position of dominance, but from a position of strategic disadvantage. This is supported by Soviet archival material. It was an attempt to rebalance, to create leverage, to force negotiation. The missiles in Cuba were not fully operational at the time they were discovered. This is confirmed in declassified CIA assessments. They were under construction, they required time. They were not an immediate, fully functioning strike capability. The presence and readiness of nuclear warheads remained uncertain in early intelligence. This uncertainty was discussed internally. It was acknowledged within ExComm. Yet, the public was not told this. The public was told that the threat was immediate, that nuclear war could begin at any moment, that the world stood on the brink. This gap between internal knowledge and public messaging is central, because it shows that the perception of danger was amplified, shows that fear was not sanitwa chaped. The resolution of the crisis came through negotiation. The Soviet Union removed its missiles from Cuba. The United States removed its missiles from Turkey. This exchange is confirmed in declassified diplomatic communications. It was understood by both sides. It was the basis of agreement, and yet it was hidden from the public. The narrative presented was one of unilateral Soviet retreat, a victory, a moment of strength. This narrative transformed Kennedy's presidency. It elevated his image. It increased his approval. It redefined his leadership. The media played a critical role in this transformation. Television broadcasts framed the crisis as immediate and existential. Newspapers reinforced this framing. The same message was repeated across platforms. This was one of the first global media crises, and it demonstrated the power of modern communication. It showed how perception could be shaped in real time. The baby boomer generation experienced this directly. They remember the fear. They remember the broadcasts. These memories are real. But the interpretation of those memories is not fixed, because fear does not necessarily reflect reality. It reflects perception. Over time, that perception became embedded as truth. The crisis was remembered as the closest call, as 1 minute to midnight. But when compared to other historical events, this claim does not hold. Carthage was destroyed completely. The Black Death wiped out large portions of entire populations. World War II devastated continents. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were destroyed by nuclear weapons in reality, not theory. These events involved actual destruction, actual death, actual collapse. The Cuban Missile Crisis involved none of these outcomes. It involved tension, fear, uncertainty, but not destruction. To claim it was the greatest peril in history is to elevate perception above reality. It is to treat fear as equivalent to catastrophe. The crisis was serious. It involved nuclear weapons. It involved two superpowers. It required careful management. But it was not uncontrollable. It was not inevitable. And it was not unparalleled. If anything, later Cold War incidents demonstrate how fragile nuclear systems truly were. False alarms nearly triggered retaliation. Misinterpretations nearly led to escalation. Human error came close to catastrophe. These moments lacked the visibility of Cuba. They lacked the narrative structure. They lacked the central figure, and so they are less remembered. Even though, in some cases, they may have brought the world closer to actual launch conditions. This reveals something fundamental about history. It is not only shaped by events, it is shaped by how those events are told. The Cuban Missile Crisis became dominant not because it was uniquely dangerous, but because it was uniquely narratable. It had a beginning, a middle, an end, a hero, a resolution. It could be simplified. It could be repeated. Could be touched. It became myth. This myth has endured even as new evidence has emerged. Even as declassified documents have revealed the complexity of the situation. Because myths are not easily displaced. They are reinforced by memory, by identity, by culture. The idea that one generation lived through the most dangerous moment in history is powerful. It gives meaning to experience. It validates fear. But when examined critically, the foundation of that belief becomes unstable. The Cuban Missile Crisis was not 1 minute to midnight. It was a moment shaped by perception, a moment amplified by media, a moment used to reinforce political authority. It was not the edge of annihilation. It was the construction of a narrative that made it appear that way. And that narrative has endured for decades. The lesson is not that the crisis was insignificant. The lesson is that it has been misunderstood. History is not just what happens, it is what is remembered. And what is remembered is often shaped by power. The Cuban Missile Crisis remains one of the most studied events of the Cold War, but understanding it requires looking beyond the surface, beyond the speeches, beyond the headlines, beyond the myth. It requires returning to the evidence, to the documents, to the context. And when we do that, the conclusion becomes unavoidable. It was not 1 minute to midnight. Not even close. For an in-depth look at the reality of the Cuban Missile Crisis, be sure to get yourself a copy of my latest book, 1 Minute to Midnight. Not Quite the Truth of the Cuban Missile Crisis, available on Kindle as an e-book and soon in paperback. Remember to like and subscribe